Hi, this is Dan from Witchwaker Appliance Repairs. Usually on this channel I'm going through common New Zealand and Australian washing machines, dishwashers, appliances in general, and talking about the common problems that you as the owner or user can fix. I'm not going usually through the uncommon faults, and the issue for that is twofold. One is that every little problem is so varied that trying to get a video to cover everything could be quite in depth. And what we start ending up into is actually into technician training videos, where we're going to be showing you not necessarily how to fix this exact problem, but how do we go through diagnosing and fixing the problems of machines in general. Now, it is something else I am looking at doing for training appliance techs for me and for other people in New Zealand in the future. It's going to take a lot of work to do. And one big process of that is talking about the diagnostic process. And there's a video which I will put on this channel, which I've made running through the basic diagnostic process we use. What I'm going to do is, I've had a question from a user who lives in America, where there's not anyone nearby who knows a lot about the Fisher & Paykel washing machines. And it's not the first thing that comes to mind. You know, he's checked the basic stuff and it's not going to solve the problem. I'm going to use his comments we've had going back and forth as a bit of an example. Twofold. One is that hopefully it might help him. I'll show him how I'd work through his problem. It might also help you, show you how to think through your problem you're having, but also just to demonstrate why, unfortunately, if you've got a weird case that's outside what the video is talking about, feel free to ask a question. I'll answer where I can, but it's sometimes well beyond what can be described in a few YouTube comments or a simple video, and you unfortunately do sometimes need to get a technician in. So these are the processes for diagnostic that's often taught in general across all industries. I think this particular series comes from the US Navy. This is my steps, and this is steps for the whole repair process. Collect the evidence. That includes from the customer's description, just get the fault to happen ourselves, download with the computer whatever is required there, check fault codes, analyze the evidence, and this is where the big thing comes into effect: experience. Knowledge. And appropriately, the knowledge is made up of two things. One, the service manual, and your experience. You need one of these two things. Really, you need both. If you don't have one, you can get away if you've got enough of the other. If you're watching these videos, you probably don't have experience in fixing appliances. You may also not have access to a service manual, but even then, with access to the fault codes of the service manuals as we're talking about here, it may not be enough, because that experience is made of two things. One is that problems you've seen before, and other is knowing the expected functions and the steps of the cycle the machine is going to go through, and what exactly those fault codes are referring to, all that kind of stuff. And if you're missing this, then it doesn't matter how good the service manual is if it's not one of the things the service manual is covering, because again, the service manual only covers the common issues. There's going to be things that they never thought of when they're writing the service manual, or little wee side edge cases. And so if you haven't got a simple problem there, then unfortunately you're going to need to get someone who's got experience. And this problem we've got at the moment actually comes all the way through to this expected function. It's not a common problem. It's not something which we see very often. So we're going to need to go through step by step how the machine should be working, how is it actually working, and then from there determine what the problem is. As we're talking about here, listing possible faulty functions, localizing the faulty function, and then localize the faulty component, which is a slightly different process to how I have it. So these comments are from a guy called James, and he's got a Fisher & Paykel washing machine, and it is a GWL15. Now this is an American model number. New Zealand model numbers in Australia and Thailand are a bit different. So GW tells us that it's the high spec version on the control board, but it hasn't got a display. So New Zealand we have MW, we used to have LW, which is a very old one. GW, this is the basic one. This is the advanced. That means you've got more control over your water levels and water temperatures. Basic, advanced, and then we also have the IW in New Zealand, which is our intuitive washing machines, and they have an LCD display that actually comes up with text and will tell you fault codes a lot easier. And they're also called Intuitive Eco because they have an eco recirculating system. Now, I didn't realise this straight off because we don't deal with this model in New Zealand, but this GW machine has an Intuitive Eco recirculation system in it. The L is large. So New Zealand, as well as that, would have MW503. Oh no, that's far too old. Let's go 512. 5 means it's 5.5 kilo, and 12 means the smart drive 12. So in this case, the number is different. It's an L because it's a large. So they have compact, medium, and large. I don't even know if they sell the compact in America. So large means it would be the equivalent of 7.5 or 8 kg here in New Zealand. And 1.5, I'm not entirely sure. It's basically the equivalent of a smart drive 11 or 12, and it's not too much of a problem. To be honest, I haven't actually looked up this model, but we're going off experience and expected function here. So James says that he's got this washing machine, and the hot white flashes red, along with beeping. Keeps doing it every wash cycle until he unplugs it from the wall outlet and resets it. So on the video I did earlier about user fault codes, the hot water light flashing red means that it's not getting water. If it flashes a cold light, it means it can't get cold water. Hot light, it can't get hot water. Both together means it can't get any water. Now he's gone out and he's purchased another hot and a cold valve and put them in, and it hasn't fixed the problem. Now this is where the experience comes in. Because he thought it might be a faulty coil, if a smart drive has an open circuit coil, it will give you a fault, a 49, a 50, a 51, as soon as you power it on. It's just the way the smart drives work. They run a voltage splitter through the water valves. It will not boot up properly if you've got a faulty valve. So you don't usually go looking at valves straight away. But unfortunately, James, of course, didn't know that. He was just going, okay, I've got a problem saying that I'm not getting hot water. I've got hot water there. Let's try a valve. So he's still got the same fault coming up. He also sees it seems to take a long time to fill. And he has to manually advance it to get it through the cycles. And he's wondering about whether he should get another new washing machine. Now, I quickly replied back. I usually check notes, comments on YouTube about once every day or two. I don't usually have a whole lot of time to spend on it. It's just in between other paperwork, and I'm having to be sitting at the computer. I'll quickly see if there's any comments there. And I said, are you filling on cold or warm? Is your hot tap turned on? Now, the other thing I said is if you're setting cold and it's still flashing hot, there is a user setting which is for controlled cold, which means it could still be looking for hot water, even though it's set on cold. So there's a few different traps there. You've got to know the machines to know these potentials. So that's already 3 things we could be looking at. It could be a faulty valve. It could be the fact that he's got a tap turned off and they're just putting on cold and thinks it doesn't need hot. It could be blocked out filters. So, and that's before we get out of the first comment. The other thing to look at would be the drain hose. The drain hose is sitting too low. The machine can siphon water out. And I will do a video on that. If the machine is siphoning, then it's filling up, and as fast as it's filling, it'll be siphoning water out. It doesn't know it's siphoning. It just knows that the water's not coming in. And so it assumes that it must be a valve's faulty or it can't get the water. And so it'll start flashing that red light saying, I can't get water. Now the difference here is it's flashing just the hot, which usually means it's getting cold. So the GW machine actually senses the water level, the water temperature, sorry, and it will mix hot and cold looking for its target temperature. And so it thinks it can get water, it just can't get enough hot, which would usually be blocked filters or hot tap turned off. So that was my first thought. He came back and said, yes, hot tap is turned on, drain hose hasn't been moved in years. He's gone through and checked all the wiring harness. And I said, he did a test cycle, got to the rinse cycle after many fillings and emptying water draining, the machine started its beeping tones again. This time it looked like an error 51. Now this is more information we're collecting. Usually if I'd come for the job, I'd plug my computer in and we'd look for fault codes. And we'd probably find this. Error 51 was actually F. Usually being a fault Fisher and Paykel. We have fault 51, which we'll get to in a second. And we also have meaning empty and fill. Now this is a bit of a red flag because these machines should not be repeatedly emptying and filling. Fisher and Paykel Smart Drive will fill up once the wash, it'll drain out, it'll do a spray rinse, it'll fill up for a deep rinse, it'll drain out, that's all it should do. If it goes out of balance, it will fill up to try and redistribute the load, and it'll do that several times before it comes up and says out of balance. But that wouldn't be flashing the water temperature light. But so immediately there's another series of things we need to look at. Is the machine going out of balance? Why is it filling up? But then we've got this error 51. Now this is where I realised that we're working with an intuitive washing machine. So error 51 is saying water loss during recirculation. So, how the Fisher & Paykel Smart Drive Eco mode works is that in the bottom of the bowl we have the little pump, which I am atrocious at drawing, and there's a little filter above there, and then out here we have a drain hose. In most machines that hose goes straight out to the drain, but on the Intuitive Eco machines, or in this case obviously this model here, it goes to a little Y valve, and one hose goes up and out to the drain, the other goes back into the bowl. So what it can do is it can run a lower water level, which is why they call it Intuitive Eco in New Zealand, Eco for using less water. It'll run the drain pump, but it'll switch this valve across to spray the water back on top of the washing, so it doesn't need to use as much water. And that will happen to going back to our expected function, the machine will fill, usually to about low water level. As it's doing that, it will turn on this valve, and I'm going to make a separate video on how these valves work, and I'll upload that in the next few days. It'll turn on this valve, it takes about 30 seconds to a minute to switch over. It'll then turn on the drain pump, and it'll recirculate the water. It'll do that for a while, and then it'll start filling, and it'll kind of alternate between just recirculating and filling together, and just filling, until it gets to the correct water level and washes. So now I know that we've got this system in here. What can happen is if this valve doesn't switch across properly, you can still have some recirculating, but you can have water coming out the drain as well. So that's why they've added this code in, which isn't in the other machines, where it realizes that if it's trying to do the recirculation and the water level drops, then it knows that there's probably something in this valve. Either the valve's not switching over at all, or it's stuck halfway. And it's very common to get something like a toothpick or a hair clip, something like that, into the valve and block it from going. I'll just actually show you guys roughly what the valve looks on this video. So the water comes in the bottom here, and then you've got two outlets, and there's a wax motor here, which pushes up on this little piston here, and will switch between the two. It's got a reasonable bit of torque, but it's very slow acting, and it won't, if there's something in there, it won't be able to seal properly, and so you will lose some water. A good test of that is that when you get to agitate and recirculate, you should immediately look at the end of your drain hose. There should be no water coming out of here while it's recirculating. So that's something I think James needs to check. I'll go through the steps in a second. But so what I said is, that makes a lot more sense. Because now I'm starting to realise what's happening. We're actually probably losing water down this drain. So I suggest to him that he takes off and checks this valve. Remind him to unplug the power, because these are always got a high voltage DC kind of floating around them, which you don't really want to get in contact with. And see if he's got, I expect him to find something in there, a little toothpick, something like that. Unfortunately he came back, and I also said to him, he came back and said, yeah, he'd checked that, couldn't find anything in it. He's thinking, could be a faulty control board. I think what's happening here, he's looking at the service manual, and that will list things like blockage in the first, primary, secondary, and tertiary fault causes. And you'll probably find usually the tertiary cause would be control board faulty, often kind of at the end of the list. One thing I always tell technicians when I'm training them is, it's not a faulty control board. If you take that process in, unless the control board's dead, it's not a faulty control board, because most of the time it's not. There'll be a few cases where it is a control board, but usually if you just get another control board, which is what James asked here, should I buy another control board? Should I be throwing that extra money into this machine? And I said no. That code is referring to a water valve. Diverter valve, diverter or recirculation valve. I would replace this valve before you start going and replacing control boards. But you got to know the machine, you got to know the process. So that's where we're sitting right now. I'm going to just run through, we're basically at the collect evidence, analyze evidence section. So we've got a machine that was flashing red light. Should really be at the top of the list, but we have an F51 and we have mini empty and fill. Mini empty and fill backs up something going on funny here. So I would be inclined to try and fix this problem first before we start worrying about this problem here. If it was me on site, I'd plug my computer in and would look for the cycle count. So that's something we need to know. And the reason for that is if we can also do it in the manual fault code mode. I think I showed that in my other video. If you know what cycle count we're at now, we can then see what cycle count 51 happened at, how many cycles ago did it happen, and how many cycles ago these faults here. Now I'm assuming from James's notes that this actually came up as a current fault, so it's not him going in and checking the fault codes and seeing it. And also, if he has checked the fault code and seen it, it means it's happened in the last 7 or 8 cycles. So we can assume this is the current fault, but usually we would check cycle count for that and for this user warning and confirm that user warning is the same one. Now we're not getting some weird lights coming out which are unrelated. So the first thing we'd want to do is go into diagnostic mode, activate the hot and cold valve, make sure they both turn on, or set it fill on hot and then switch it to cold and make sure they're both coming on and never getting hot water through. Very unlikely to be a faulty temperature sensor. Very unlikely. I think I've had 1, maybe 2 play up. Usually they play up by being slightly out of range, so in sub-zero temperatures, when your water starts freezing, the control board will complain because it thinks the water should never freeze. And I have had some which are reporting temperatures above 100 when it's not. The machine will often still work, but very unlikely to be a faulty sensor. So we'd want to check that the hot water valve is working. So that's what I also mentioned to him. And he says he's already checked that. So we're getting hot water in okay. That's the first step. Then I would probably ignore this and start looking into why we're getting these codes here. So we're getting water loss, and he talks about multiple emptying water and refilling. We'd kind of want to know when in the cycle this emptying and filling is happening. If it's happening while the machine is still on the wash lights, then it's probably to do with this here. If it was happening later in the cycle towards the rinse and the spin, we'd probably want to be checking towards our balance, make sure it's not going out of balance. But from what he says, it sounds like it's happening early in the cycle, and that's why it's taking a long time to go through the cycle, because it's taking a long time to fill up. This valve here, I'll do another video on how it works, but basically he's checked this valve and it doesn't look blocked. So we need now to take this valve out and test it and make sure that it actually works. And as I said, I'll do a second video on that. Basically we can apply power to these 2 terminals here, and after about 30 seconds the plunger will move across, and looking inside the inlet for it we should see the little arm with 2 seals on it move all the way across and seal. If that's not moving all the way across, or if it's not going at all, then that could be the faulty component. The other way we could test it, as I said, is you get it filling up, wait for it to go to recirculation, and check the end of the drain. So if we put it on spin, now admittedly if we switch straight from recirculation to spin, it will take about 3 or 4 minutes for it to cool down enough. But if after it's been off for a while we put it on spin, we should have all water coming out here and no water coming out here. If we put it on wash, it'll fill up to the low water level and then start recirculating. We should have all water coming out here and no water coming out the drain. So the second thing we need to check, we can check that without taking the valve out, is draining during recirc. Good. Now this is what the fault code 51 is telling us, is that it is draining during the recirc. I would assume this is going to be a yes. If it's not, then we're doubting the fault code, and we're going to have to really watch what the machine's actually doing, and it's going to take more than what I can explain even in this video. Unless it's a leak. The other thing, if water was leaking out somewhere else, it could be totally unrelated to this, but it's still losing water during the recirculation. So that's the only thing if it's a no. But I'm going to assume this is a yes, it is draining during the recirculation. So it's either a faulty valve or a faulty control board. What we'd then do is, as I said, we'd take this valve out and we'd test it, make sure it's not blocked, make sure that it closes all the way across. So the default resting state is drain, and then after it's been activated, it'll switch to the recirculation stage. And so it should fully close across. The other thing we'd do if that was okay, so we're assuming yes, remove and test diverter valve. If that's faulty, we're going to replace it. If it's okay, then the last stage would be to check voltage to diverter. So when that diverter is activated, we should be getting a voltage from the control board. I'm not sure entirely what voltage we'll be doing with here, because sometimes on these machines it can be high voltage DC. I'm pretty sure on these, in the New Zealand machines, it's 240 volts AC. So I'm assuming that it's going to be about 110 volts AC. But we should be able to, you can check that 2 different ways. You can either get down underneath the machine, get some probes onto there, or if you get on the control board, sometimes you've got nice thin probes on your multimeter. You can get onto the back of the plug while it's still plugged in. It does also monitor the resistance of the diverter valve to tell which position it's in, so you can't really unplug it and see what's happening. You need to leave it plugged in. So here he's going to need to have a multimeter, and he's going to need to be careful because he's now working on a live machine. And basically I do not advise you to work on a live machine. Everything is live in these Fisher & Paykel's while they're plugged in. You have high voltages floating around all over the place. He might get away with it being 110 volts, but this is basically the steps I'd go through. But he needs to know what he's doing and be very careful, because people often don't realise how long they hold the charge for, how everything is live. Even when, like, when your drain pump's turned off, you have a 240 volts floating there. So you touch the drain pump wires while the machine's off but still plugged into the wall, you'll get an electric shock off it. So got to be really careful. But that's the last thing, check voltage of the diverter. What can happen is these can get moisture in them. As you can see, this one's got a plastic casing on it. When they came out originally, they didn't. Moisture gets inside. If you have a look at my other video on, I'll take one of these wax actuators apart. It'll short out. Then if you take apart your control board, you'll find that the little wee triac which turns on the diverter will have blown up. Usually that also kills the control board, so the whole control board's dead. It is possible that the diverter has failed to damage the control board, and so there's nothing blocking it, but the control board, just that part of the circuit that turns the diverter on, is dead. In that case, you need to replace the control board and the diverter valve as well, because if you put a new control board in, it could fail. You do have a list telling you what resistance to look for. It's usually a very wide range of resistance. If I'm replacing control board, I always open it apart on an eco and look for that part of the circuit. If you have a very close look on this here, see if I can get it to focus. Might take a photo of it. There's a tiny bit of black mark at the bottom there where it started to burn out. So that's the possible causes there. So this process here comes into locating fault and determining cause. We're going to be locating the fault by confirming whether or not the water is actually coming out the drain when it should be diverting. Then we're going to be determining the cause by just deciding whether or not it's a diverter valve or a controller. And then after that we'd go through the process of repairing it. So that's quite a bit, and I've probably gone through all of it a bit fast, but basically that shows you how there are so many possible causes pointing towards one problem. And that's why, unfortunately, some of these videos I can't go into exact detail on things. And also why it's quite hard to find technicians sometimes, because you've got to know how the machine works, what it's looking for at each stage, what's expecting to happen, what the fault codes actually mean. And it takes a long time to build up that knowledge about these machines in each individual brand, different machines, differences between, as I said, these different models here, which ones have got water temperature sensors, which ones have got the recirculation system. It takes quite a bit of time, and that's what you're paying for when you get an appliance technician out. You're paying for the experience and knowing what's happening there. And this is the issue that James has found, as he mentioned in his last comment to me before I made this video. He's called a local service agent. They tell him parts of Fisher & Paykel are hard to get, and many service techs do not care to work on the machines anymore because they ultimately ends up being control board issues that have gone bad. And see, I would disagree with that, but that's because probably about 50% of the work I do is Fisher & Paykel. That's because I live in New Zealand, where Fisher & Paykel, we don't have parts made here anymore, but I can get parts to me relatively quickly. It used to be overnight. Unfortunately, it's not like that anymore. It takes a couple of days to get parts. I've got a good look-up system. I carry thousands of dollars worth of Fisher & Paykel parts. So it depends on your experience with your local technicians as well as to how they're going to be able to fix the problem. But hopefully a technician who knows the diagnostic process, and they're probably going to still need a service manual because Fisher & Paykel are pretty much unlike anything else. But if a technician to invest that time into has got to have enough machines around to make it worthwhile for him to study and get experience on those machines. If he's only repairing your one and he has to do 2 hours worth of reading service manuals to get himself up to speed before he comes and looks at it, then I don't blame them for not wanting to look at it, unfortunately. I would assume that there are Fisher & Paykel techs who are experts in US and whatnot, so you probably have to ring around and find someone who's the expert. Again, if it's going to be worth the cost, I don't know. That's a decision up to you. But yeah. Hope that helps, James. And feel free to ask any questions in the comments of any of my videos. I will always help a little bit, but there will be times where I might refer to this video and say, look, here's a diagnostic process. You might need to get someone who knows what they're looking at. Cheers.